It literally takes 5 minutes to read a laminated piece of paper, but some folks would rather just yell until their face turns purple. Let's just dive right into the madness.
Cape Coral, Florida. In the immediate aftermath of a Category 4 hurricane is a lot of things. But mostly, it's just a wet, rotting sauna. Imagine taking a hot shower, but the water is made of lukewarm swamp mud. The towel is entirely constructed out of angry mosquitoes, and the air itself is so thick you could practically chew it. You step outside, and instantly, your shirt fuses to your spine. The smell is a unique, unforgettable cocktail of pulverized pine needles, stagnant canal water, and the quiet despair of 1,000 ruined lawn ornaments. It is not a place for the weak. It is definitely not a place for the unprepared. And buddy, I am prepared. I'm just a guy who respects the sheer, unpredictable hostility of nature. I don't mess around when the meteorologists start looking panicked on the local news. While everyone else was panic buying the last crushed box of strawberry Pop-Tarts at Publix and fighting over lukewarm bottles of Dasani, I was in my garage, lovingly caressing my absolute pride and joy. We're talking about a 12,000-watt, industrial-grade, dual-fuel monster of a generator. I bought this beautiful, hideous chunk of machinery at a government surplus auction 3 years ago. It's painted an aggressive hazard cone orange. It weighs as much as a small horse. And it is loud. Oh, is it loud? It doesn't just purr. It roars like a Huey helicopter trying to land on a tin roof. It's the kind of machine that doesn't just provide electricity. It aggressively commands the electrons to bend to its will. It can power a small hospital, or in my case, a 3-bedroom ranch house with the central air set to a crisp, meat locker 68 degrees. And then, there's Brenda. Brenda lives directly to my left, in a house painted a shade of beige so boring it aggressively offends the retinas. If you looked up the word audacity in the dictionary, you wouldn't find a definition. You'd just find a high-definition photograph of Brenda holding a clipboard. Picture the sensible haircut, the kind of asymmetrical bob that screams, "I need to speak to the regional manager, and I have the corporate number on speed dial." Picture the permanent scowl etched into her face, like she just caught a whiff of spoiled milk but can't quite locate the carton. We have history, Brenda and I. Oh, we have a rich, beautifully petty history. She's the self-appointed neighborhood watchdog. We don't even have a formal, legally binding HOA with actual enforcement power. It's just a neighborhood beautification committee that she somehow elected herself president of. But that doesn't stop her from acting like she's the Supreme Court justice of lawn care. Let me paint you a picture of what living next to Brenda is like. 2 months before the storm hit, I was in my driveway, minding my own business, changing the oil on my truck. It was a Tuesday. A beautiful, quiet Tuesday. Suddenly, I hear the clip-clop of sensible orthopedic walking shoes marching down my driveway. I slide out from under the chassis, grease on my hands, to find Brenda standing there, her clipboard pressed against her chest like a shield. "Excuse me," she had said, her voice dripping with that fake, sugary southern sweetness that actually translates to pure venom. "Are you aware that your street, that Augustin grass is currently in violation of the community guidelines?" I wiped my hands on a rag, staring at her. "Brenda, I mowed it 3 days ago." "The bylaws clearly state," she retorted, tapping the clipboard with a manicured fingernail, "that grass must not exceed 2 3/4 inches. I measured yours this morning. It is hovering dangerously close to 3 inches near the mailbox. I'm issuing a warning." "You measured my grass?" I asked, genuinely trying to process the level of unhinged free time this woman possessed. "With a ruler?" "I have a calibrated measuring stick specifically for this purpose," she sniffed, turning on her heel. Have it rectified by tomorrow, or I will be forced to escalate." Escalate to who, Brenda? The ghost of George Washington? That's who I'm dealing with. A woman who measures grass, and a woman who once called the non-emergency police line because my Christmas lights were flashing at a disruptive frequency. So you can imagine how absolutely thrilled she was going to be when my 12,000-watt surplus beast woke up from its slumber. But before the beast could wake, the storm had to hit. Hurricane Ian didn't just hit Cape Coral, it parked over it and threw a temper tantrum. I spent 12 hours huddled in my interior hallway, listening to the wind sound like a freight train ripping through a tunnel of bubble wrap. The pressure dropped so low my ears popped every time I swallowed. The house groaned, the roof shuddered, and outside the world was being put through a giant, watery blender. It started with a flicker. The lights in the hallway dimmed, surged back with a blinding brightness, and then pop. Darkness. The kind of absolute, oppressive darkness that makes you realize how entirely dependent we are on the fragile little grid of wires holding society together. The hum of the refrigerator died. The gentle rattle of the air conditioner ceased. Silence descended inside the house, instantly replaced by the terrifying roar of the hurricane outside. The grid was dead. And in Florida, when the grid dies, the clock starts ticking. Morning finally broke, revealing a sky the color of a bruised plum. The wind had died down to a stiff, nervous breeze, but the damage was apocalyptic. I pushed my front door open, shoving aside a rogue palm frond that had wedged itself against the frame. My yard looked like a bomb went off in a salad bar. Fences were smashed into jagged wooden teeth. Trash cans were miles away in other zip codes. So the grand oak tree at the end of the street had been uprooted entirely, taking a chunk of the sidewalk with it and crushing a Honda Civic like a soda can. And the heat. The heat was already rising, baking the stagnant water, turning the neighborhood into a giant, miserable terrarium. My neighbors were slowly emerging from their houses, looking like zombies shuffling out of crypts. They were sweaty, shell-shocked, and miserable. I saw Dave from across the street, staring blankly at his destroyed screen enclosure. I saw the college kids a few doors down looking at their phones in sheer panic, realizing they had 0 bars and a fridge full of rapidly warming Busch Light. Everyone was miserable. Everyone was losing hundreds of dollars in groceries as their freezers slowly turned into tepid puddles. Everyone except me. Once I walked back into my garage, it was time. I grabbed a fresh 5-gallon jug of gasoline, uncapped the tank on the orange beast, and poured it in, the sweet smell of fuel cutting through the scent of wet drywall. I checked the oil. Perfect. I flipped the choke, turned the fuel valve, and grabbed the pull cord. I didn't even need to yank it hard. One smooth, practiced pull, and the engine coughed, sputtered for a fraction of a second. And then, boom! The magnificent, deafening symphony of combustion filled the garage. I rolled the generator out onto the back patio, the heavy rubber tires crunching over fallen twigs. I plugged in the massive 50-amp transfer cable that ran directly to my breaker box. I threw the main disconnect, isolating my house from the dead grid, and flipped the generator breaker. Inside, the house shuddered back to life. It was magic. Pure, unadulterated, fossil-fueled magic. The microwave beeped a cheerful greeting. The lights flickered and held steady. And then, the absolute sweetest sound in the known universe, the heavy rhythmic thrum of the central air conditioning compressor kicking on. Within minutes, the heavy, suffocating humidity inside my house began to retreat, replaced by a glorious icy blast coming from the vents. I walked into my kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and grabbed an ice-cold beer. I popped the top, walked out to my front porch, and sat down in my patio chair. I took a long, refreshing sip, letting the condensation drip down my fingers. I looked down the street. It was eerie. The neighborhood was dead silent, save for the distant, muffled sound of a chainsaw a few blocks over, and the very loud, very proud, unrelenting mechanical roar coming from my backyard. I saw curtains twitching. I saw neighbors peeking out of their windows like startled meerkats, their faces pressed against the glass, looking toward my house with a mixture of profound awe and deep, jealous longing. I was the sole beacon of civilization in a sea of primitive humidity. I had ice. I had Wi-Fi running off a battery backup. I had air conditioning. I was a king on a motorized throne. But kings always have enemies. And my enemy was already on the move. I didn't even see her coming at first. I was too busy enjoying the contrast between the icy beer and the sweltering heat. But then, I heard the crunch of sensible shoes marching over pulverized debris. It was Brenda. She was dodging fallen branches with military precision, her face a mask of absolute, unhinged fury. Says she didn't have her clipboard, presumably it had blown away in the storm, but she had her index finger extended like a bayonet, and she was aiming it right at my face. She stomped right up to the edge of my property line, stopping exactly where the grass, which she could no longer measure because it was covered in tree limbs, met the sidewalk. "Turn it off!" she shrieked. I blinked, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my beer. "Good morning to you too, Brenda. Rough night?" "Do not patronize me," she yelled, having to raise her voice significantly to be heard over the beautiful, steady hum of my generator. "Turn that monstrous machine off right this second. It is rattling my fine china in the hutch." "Brenda, the grid is dead," I said calmly, leaning back in my chair. "It's a disaster zone out here. My fridge is full of meat. My freezer is full of steaks. That machine stays on." "It is a public nuisance," she screamed, taking a step onto my driveway. "It sounds like a freight train. I cannot hear myself think." That might be a blessing, I thought. But I kept my mouth shut. Instead, I tried to be reasonable. I really did. I know the machine is loud. I'm not a monster. "Look, Brenda," I said, setting my beer down. "I know it's noisy, but we're going to be without power for days, maybe weeks. If you want, I have a spare 110-volt outlet on the panel. I can run an extension cord over to your house so you can plug in your refrigerator. Keep your food from spoiling. Truce?" I offered her an olive branch. I offered her the holy grail of hurricane survival, temporary power. She looked at me like I had just offered her a plate of warm garbage. "I do not want your dirty, illegal electricity," she spat. "I want peace and quiet. You are in direct violation of the Cape Coral Municipal Code regarding decibel levels for motorized equipment in residential zones. If you do not shut that infernal contraption down in the next 5 minutes, I am calling the police, and I am calling code enforcement. You will be heavily fined." I stared at her. I looked at the devastation around us. Trees were snapped in half. Power lines were dangling in the street. The entire infrastructure of our city was currently laying on its side, bleeding out. And this woman was threatening me with a noise ordinance violation. The audacity was almost majestic. It was breathtaking. "Brenda," I said, my voice dropping the friendly pretense, "the police are currently rescuing people from flooded homes. So code enforcement is probably busy figuring out which buildings are structurally sound. Do you honestly think they care about a generator noise complaint right now?" "We will see about that, you noise terrorist," she yelled, turning on her heel and marching back toward her dark, sweltering house. "Consider yourself warned." A noise terrorist. That was a new one. I picked up my beer, took another sip, and smiled. Challenge accepted, Brenda. If she thought the generator was loud running at a 30% load just keeping my house cool, she had no idea what it sounded like when it actually had to work for a living. The beast had an idle control switch. When it wasn't drawing a lot of power, it ran relatively quietly. Well, quiet for a surplus industrial engine. But when you put a heavy electrical load on it, the engine revved up to meet the demand. And it got deeper. It got throatier. It got louder. I finished my beer, crushed the can, and walked into my garage. It was time to build the spider web. I walked over to a massive, reinforced plastic storage crate sitting in the corner. I popped the heavy latches and threw open the lid. Inside lay my arsenal. Hundreds and hundreds of feet of thick, yellow, heavy-duty 10-gauge extension cords. I had been buying them on clearance for years, hoarding them like a dragon hoards gold, waiting for a moment exactly like this. I hauled the crate out to the driveway. The sun was really starting to bake now, the humidity rising off the asphalt in shimmering waves. I grabbed the first bundle of cords, threw it over my shoulder, and started walking. My first stop was Dave's house across the street. I knocked on his front door. Dave answered. Was looking pale and exhausted, dabbing at his forehead with a washcloth. "Hey man," Dave said, his voice raspy. "You survived." "Barely," I said, gesturing to the massive yellow cord coiled over my shoulder. "Listen, I got plenty of juice. I know you use a CPAP machine at night. You want me to hook you up? Run your fridge, a couple of fans, keep the medical equipment going?" Dave looked at the cord, then looked at me, and I swear to you. The man almost cried. "Are you serious?" he choked out. "Man, it was so hot last night I couldn't breathe. I was terrified about the CPAP. "Don't worry about it," I said, unspooling the cord. "Just prop open a window in the back. I'll run it right into the living room." I ran the cord down his driveway. As across the street, making sure to tuck it neatly into the expansion joint of the concrete so it wasn't a tripping hazard, and right up to his house. Stop number 2, the college kids. These guys were renting the house 3 doors down. 3 guys in their early 20s, usually a bit rowdy, but decent kids. I found them sitting on their porch, looking mournfully at a giant cooler. "Boys," I said, dragging the next yellow snake of power up their driveway. "Status report." "It's bad, dude," one of them, a kid named Tyler wearing a backwards hat, sighed. "The ice is melting. The beer is getting warm. The hot pockets are thawing. It's a tragedy." "Stand back," I said, grinning. "Salvation is here." I tossed them the female end of a 100-foot cord. "Plug your fridge in. Plug a fan in. Keep the beer cold." Tyler looked at the cord like it was Excalibur. "Dude, you are a literal god. We owe you a case when the store's open." "Just keep the noise down tonight," I laughed. Stop number 3. Sweet old Mrs. Higgins, directly to my right. Mrs. Higgins is an 80-year-old widow who bakes cookies for the mailman and spends her days tending to her immaculate rose garden, which was currently crushed under a fallen oak branch. I walked up to her door and knocked gently. She opened the door, fanning herself with a magazine, looking frail in the stifling heat. "Mrs. Higgins, it's me," I said gently. "How are you holding up?" "Oh, hello, dear," she said, offering a weak smile. "It's awfully warm, isn't it? I'm just worried about my insulin in the refrigerator. The doctor says it goes bad if it gets too warm." "Not today, Mrs. "Was Higgins," I said, pulling out a specialized multi-plug adapter. "I'm running a line from my generator. We'll get your fridge powered right up. You can plug in a lamp and a fan, too." She clasped her hands over her heart. "Oh, bless you, child. Bless you. You are an angel." I spent the next 2 hours doing this. I went from house to house. The young couple with the newborn baby? Hooked up. The guy who works from home and needed his router on battery backup to tell his boss he survived? Hooked up. By noon, my property looked like the epicenter of a neon yellow electrical explosion. Thick, 10-gauge cords radiated out from my backyard, snaking through the grass, across driveways, and over fences. It was a literal, glowing web of community support. I had daisy-chained heavy-duty splitters, meticulously calculating the amperage draw to make sure I wasn't overloading the generator's massive alternator. And the generator? Oh, the generator was singing now. With 6 different refrigerators, a dozen fans, and a CPAP machine suddenly pulling power, the beast woke up entirely. The idle control slammed wide open. The RPMs spiked. The mechanical roar deepened into a guttural, ground-shaking bellow. It sounded like a diesel locomotive idling in my backyard. It was glorious. I stood in my driveway, admiring my handiwork. Every house on the block had a yellow umbilical cord tying them to my property, bringing them the sweet relief of modern electricity. Except one. I looked to my left. Brenda's house sat in complete, dark, sweaty silence. No yellow cord crossed her property line. No fans whirred in her windows. So she was entirely excluded from the grid of survival by her own arrogant choice. I imagined her sitting in there, her sensible haircut wilting in the humidity, listening to the deafening roar of my generator working overtime to power the rest of the neighborhood. The spite was delicious. It tasted better than the cold beer. But I knew Brenda. She wasn't going to sit in the dark and sweat quietly. She was a woman of action. She was a woman who demanded to speak to the manager. And sure enough, about an hour later, a Cape Coral Police Department cruiser rolled slowly down the debris-strewn street. The cruiser had to swerve to avoid a downed street sign and slowly crackled over a bed of pine cones before pulling up in front of my house. The lights weren't flashing, but the intent was clear. I was sitting on my porch, enjoying a sandwich I'd just made with fresh, cold deli meat, watching the show. 2 officers stepped out. They looked absolutely miserable. Their dark blue uniforms were stained with sweat. Their boots were caked in mud, and they had the dead-eyed stare of men who had been working 36 hours straight, dealing with looters, flooded cars, and frantic citizens. And then, out from her front door, bursting like a bat out of a very humid hell, came Brenda. "Officers! Officers, thank God you're here!" she wailed, waving her arms frantically as she speed-walked toward them. "You need to arrest him, or cite him, or confiscate that machine." The older officer, a guy with salt and pepper hair and a name tag that read Sergeant Miller, sighed heavily, adjusting his duty belt. "Ma'am, please calm down. So we got a call about a noise disturbance?" "It's not just a disturbance, it is an assault on my eardrums," Brenda screeched, pointing a trembling finger at my backyard where the generator was happily chugging away. "He is running an industrial piece of equipment in a residential zone. It violates Chapter 12 of the Cape Coral Code of Ordinances regarding maximum decibel output. I demand you force him to shut it down." Sergeant Miller looked at Brenda, then looked at the absolute destruction surrounding them. The crushed cars, the downed power lines, the shattered roofs. And then he looked at me, sitting on my porch with a turkey sandwich. I stood up, wiped my mouth with a napkin, and strolled down the driveway to meet them. "Afternoon, officers," I said politely. "Tough day out there?" "You have no idea," the younger officer muttered, wiping his forehead. "Look, I'll be brief," I said, knowing these guys had 100 more important places to be. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out a neatly folded, laminated piece of paper. The very piece of paper that makes sovereign justice what it is. The absolute, undeniable power of knowing the rules better than the people trying to enforce them. I handed it to Sergeant Miller. "What is this?" he asked, squinting at the page in the bright sunlight. "That, officer, is the official state of emergency declaration signed by the governor of Florida 3 days ago," I explained, my voice calm and perfectly steady. Brenda scoffed loudly. "A state of emergency does not give you the right to be a public nuisance." I ignored her, keeping my eyes on the sergeant. If you look at page 3, section 4, paragraph B, well, you'll see a very specific clause. I knew it by heart, of course. It explicitly states, under Florida Statute 252.36, during a declared state of emergency, all local and municipal ordinances regarding noise, zoning, and operating hours are hereby suspended as they relate to the operation of emergency equipment, including but not limited to standby generators, chainsaws, and water pumps, necessary for the preservation of health, safety, and property. I paused, letting the legal jargon hang in the humid air. "In short, Sergeant," I smiled, Chapter 12 of the Cape Coral Code of Ordinances doesn't exist right now. Not until the governor lifts the emergency declaration. My generator is preserving the health and safety of my property, and as you can see by the yellow cords, the property of 5 other households on this street who needed medical equipment and food preserved. Sergeant Miller read the paragraph. He read it again. He looked up at the yellow cords snaking across the street to Dave's house. He looked at the cord going to sweet old Mrs. Higgins's house. Then he looked at Brenda. "Ma'am," Sergeant Miller said, his voice flat and devoid of any sympathy. "He's right. The noise ordinance is suspended. He's allowed to run the generator." Brenda's jaw dropped. She looked like a fish gasping for air on a dock. But it's too loud. I can't sleep." "Ma'am," the younger officer chimed in, clearly losing his patience. "Half the city doesn't have a roof over their heads right now. Buy some earplugs. We're leaving." "You can't just leave," she shrieked, stepping in front of the cruiser. "I am a taxpayer, and I demand enforcement." "Enforcement of what, ma'am? The law that is currently legally suspended?" Sergeant Miller said, getting back into the driver's seat. "If you block the vehicle, I will arrest you for obstructing an emergency responder during a crisis. Step aside." Brenda froze. The color drained from her face. She stepped back onto the grass, her hands shaking with rage. The cruiser threw it in reverse, navigated around the debris, and drove away, leaving Brenda and me alone in the driveway. I looked at her. I didn't gloat. I didn't laugh. I just took a slow, deliberate bite of my turkey sandwich, chewed it thoroughly, swallowed, and said, "Stay cool, Brenda." Then I turned around and walked back to my air-conditioned house. But I knew this wasn't over. Brenda wasn't just a Karen. She was an apex predator Karen. And she had just been humiliated in front of the police, defeated by a piece of laminated paper. She was wounded, and a wounded Karen is the most dangerous kind. She was going to pivot. She was going to find another angle. And she did. It only took her 24 hours to find the one government agency in Florida more ruthlessly pedantic than an HOA president. Code enforcement. It took exactly 4 hours for the White City truck to slowly crunch its way down our street. I was in my kitchen, enjoying the absolute luxury of a frozen red grape, when I heard the heavy thud of a truck door closing. I peeked through the blinds. There it was. The unmistakable, dreaded seal of the Cape Coral Code Enforcement Division plastered on the door of a Ford F-150. Brenda was already standing at the end of her driveway, as practically vibrating with a toxic mixture of smugness and adrenaline. She looked like a general overseeing a battlefield execution. I grabbed another grape, popped it in my mouth, and walked out the front door. The code enforcement officer looked like a man who had lost the will to live sometime around 2014. He was a heavily perspiring, middle-aged guy with a sunburned neck and a clipboard. Let's call him Gary. Gary looked at the downed trees. He looked at the crushed roofs. Then he looked at my magnificent, glowing web of heavy-duty yellow extension cords powering half the block. He let out a sigh that I could hear over the roar of the generator. "Is this your property, sir?" Gary asked, his voice completely devoid of joy. "Sure is," I said, leaning against my mailbox. "He's running an unlicensed, dangerous microgrid," Brenda shouted. I'm stepping so close to Gary, I thought she was going to climb into his shirt pocket. "He has high-voltage lines running across public sidewalks and property lines. It is a massive tripping hazard. It is an unpermitted electrical modification. Shut it down, Gary. Confiscate the machine." Gary winced at the volume of her voice. He looked down at his clipboard, then back up at me. "Look, buddy," Gary said, wiping a bead of sweat from his nose. "I don't care about the noise ordinance. That's suspended. But she's got a point about the cords. You can't have electrical lines crossing the public sidewalk. It's a tripping hazard. It violates city right-of-way codes, and technically, running power to multiple parcels like this without a permit violates the unfranchised utility codes. I'm gonna have to ask you to pull the cords back to your own property line." Brenda smiled. It was a terrifying, toothy grimace. She had won. She had found the one technicality that the governor's emergency declaration didn't cover. "You have 5 minutes," Brenda sneered at me, "before Gary here writes you a citation for every single household you've illegally connected." I didn't panic. I didn't get mad. I just pulled out my cell phone. "Gary, give me 10 minutes, I said. "I need to make a phone call to my licensed electrical contractor, just to make sure we do this by the book." Gary shrugged, retreating to the air-conditioned cab of his truck. Brenda scoffed, crossing her arms. I dialed my buddy Mike. Mike is a master electrician. He's the kind of guy who reads the National Electrical Code for fun while sitting on the toilet. And he lives 2 neighborhoods over, and I knew his grid was dead too. "Mike," I said when he picked up. "It's me. I need you over here right now. Bring your measuring tape, your high-visibility vest, and that giant brain of yours. We have a code enforcement situation." "I'm bored out of my mind and sweating through my couch," Mike said. "I'll be there in 10. True to his word, Mike's beat-up work van came swerving around the corner of our street 10 minutes later. He hopped out, wearing his official company polo and a neon yellow vest. He looked incredibly official. I quickly briefed him on the situation. I pointed to Gary in the truck. I pointed to Brenda, who was glaring at us like we had just insulted her ancestors. And then I pointed to the public utility pole at the back corner of my property line. Mike smiled. It was the smile of a man who was about to drop a legal atom bomb on a neighborhood nuisance. We walked over to Gary's truck. Gary rolled the window down. "Gary," Mike said, pulling out a business card and handing it to him. "Mike Henderson, Henderson Electrical, licensed and bonded in Lee County. I'm acting as the site supervisor for this emergency power operation." Gary looked at the card. "Okay, Mike, but the cords still have to come off the sidewalk." "Oh, absolutely," Mike said smoothly. "We wouldn't dream of violating a public right-of-way, but we aren't going to disconnect anyone. We're just going to reroute." Mike turned to me. "Grab the neighbors. We need to move the web." It took about 20 minutes. I went door to door and rallied the troops. Dave, the college kids, and even Mrs. Higgins' grandson came out to help. Thus, under Mike's strict supervision, we unplugged the yellow cords, dragged them off the front sidewalks, and hauled them into our backyards. Here is the beautiful, heavily guarded secret of Florida residential zoning laws. The utility easement. If you look at the plat map of almost any residential neighborhood in Cape Coral, The city and the power companies own a strip of land running exactly across the back property lines of the houses. It's usually about 3 to 5 feet wide. It's where the power poles go. It's where the underground cables are buried. And legally, it is a designated public utility right-of-way. Mike took his measuring tape and measured exactly 3 feet from my back fence line inward. "Right here," Mike pointed to the grass. "Drop the cords right here." We laid the massive bundle of yellow extension cords in a straight line running directly through the backyard utility easement, hopping over the low chain-link fences where the properties met, completely bypassing the public sidewalks and front yards. We plugged Dave back in. We plugged the college kids back in. We plugged Mrs. Higgins back in. The generator roared back to full capacity. We walked back to the front yard. Gary had gotten out of his truck and was looking thoroughly confused. Brenda was marching right behind him. "What did you do?" Brenda demanded. "I still hear it running. I know you didn't disconnect them." "Gary," Mike said, leaning on his measuring tape like a walking stick. "As you can see, all temporary power transmission lines have been removed from the pedestrian right-of-way. They are now safely routed exclusively through the rear public utility easement, and is completely in accordance with emergency hazard mitigation protocols." Gary scratched his head. "Okay, but what about the unfranchised utility violation? He's acting as a power company without a license." This was it. This was the kill shot. I stepped forward. "Actually, Gary, I am completely exempt from the jurisdiction of the Florida Public Service Commission." I pulled up a PDF on my phone that I had downloaded years ago for exactly a scenario like this. Under the Florida PSC regulations, specifically the behind-the-meter exemption rules, I read aloud. A private citizen sharing legally generated power from a standalone system is only classified as a utility if they are charging a tariff or a fee for the transmission of that electricity. The moment money changes hands, you're a utility. But if it is given freely, it is legally classified as the sharing of personal property, completely outside the jurisdiction of code enforcement or the PSC. I looked at Gary. "I haven't charged these people a single dime." Dave gave me a high five. "The college kids promised me a case of beer. That's it. This is entirely private property sharing, routed through a legal public easement, overseen by a licensed contractor." Mike crossed his arms and nodded solemnly. "I've inspected the load distribution. It's fully compliant with emergency temporary wiring standards. I'll sign off on it right now on the back of your clipboard, Gary." Gary looked at me. He looked at Mike. He looked at the PDF on my phone. He knew he was beaten. He knew that if he wrote a citation, it would get thrown out in court faster than a moldy sandwich. He was tired. He just wanted to go home and sit in front of a battery-powered fan. Gary handed his clipboard to Mike. Mike scribbled his signature and his license number on the back of a form. "All right," Gary sighed, taking the clipboard back. "Looks to be in order. Have a good day, gentlemen. Try to stay hydrated." Gary got back in his truck, put it in drive, and rolled away without looking back. Brenda was frozen. She looked like a statue carved out of pure, concentrated rage. Her ace in the hole had just driven away in a white F-150. She had played the ultimate Karen card, the code enforcement strike, and it had bounced off my impenetrable shield of bureaucratic loopholes and spite. "You," she stammered, her face turning a deep, dangerous shade of purple. "You think you're so smart?" "I think I have air conditioning, Brenda," I said softly. And I think you have a long, hot night ahead of you." She spun around and stomped back to her house, slamming her front door so hard it shook the frame. The sun finally began to set, painting the bruised Florida sky in brilliant shades of neon pink and bruised purple. As the darkness crept over the ruined neighborhood, a beautiful thing happened. My house lit up. Dave's house lit up. The college kid's house lit up. Mrs. Higgins' living room glowed with a warm yellow light. The neighborhood looked like an archipelago of glowing islands in a pitch-black ocean of destruction. Without anyone really planning it, a makeshift block party materialized in my driveway. The college kids brought over a battery-powered Bluetooth speaker and played some quiet, respectful classic rock. Dave brought over a cooler of whatever meat was left in his freezer, and we fired up my propane grill. Mrs. Higgins' grandson wheeled her over in her wheelchair, and she sat by the garage, sipping a cold glass of lemonade, smiling at the chaos. We were laughing. We were eating. We were surviving. And right next door, separated by just a few yards of ruined grass, was Brenda's house. It was a black void. It sat in total, oppressive darkness. All her windows were wide open in a desperate attempt to catch a breeze, which meant she could hear every single laugh, every single sizzle of the grill, and the beautiful, steady, unending hum of my generator keeping us all alive. It was around 9 p.m. when she finally broke. I saw a figure moving in the darkness of her front lawn. She walked slowly, like a defeated general coming to surrender her sword. She stopped at the edge of the driveway, illuminated by the glow of the grill. She looked terrible. Her sensible haircut was plastered to her forehead with sweat. Her blouse was wrinkled and damp. The rigid, self-righteous posture had completely collapsed. She looked like a woman who had spent the last 8 hours sitting in a 95-degree house, stewing in her own horrible decisions. The conversation at the grill slowly died down. Dave stopped flipping the burgers. The college kids lowered the music. Everyone turned to look at Brenda. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the ground. Then she looked up at me. It's unbearable in there," she whispered. Her voice lacked all of its usual venom. It was just tired. I didn't say anything. I just flipped a burger. "My refrigerator is warm," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "Everything is ruined. The heat is making me dizzy. I can't do it tonight." She took a deep breath, visibly swallowing her massive, mountainous pride. "Do you," she started, stopping to clear her throat. "Do you have another one of those yellow cords?" The silence in the driveway was absolute. Even the crickets seemed to stop chirping to listen to this historic moment. Brenda, the terror of the neighborhood, the woman who measured grass with a ruler, was begging for the very electricity she had called the police over just hours ago. I looked at her. I looked at the dark, miserable tomb of her house. A lesser man might have caved. A lesser man might have handed her a cord and said, "Let bygones be bygones." But I am not a lesser man. What I am the founder of sovereign justice, and actions have consequences. I put my grilling tongs down on the side table. I grabbed a clean rag, wiped my hands, and walked over to her. I stood a respectful distance away, looking her dead in the eye. "Oh, Brenda," I said, my voice dripping with the exact same fake, sugary southern sweetness she had used on me all those months ago. "I would absolutely love to help you out. I really would. I have a spare 110-volt outlet open on the panel right now." Her eyes lit up with a desperate flicker of hope. "You do?" "I do," I nodded solemnly. "But unfortunately, there's a major problem." "What problem?" she asked, a hint of panic creeping back into her voice. "Well," I sighed heavily, looking over at Mike, who was leaning against his van, trying very hard not to laugh. "You see, Brenda, earlier today, You formally complained to code enforcement about the electrical load of my generator. The hope in her eyes began to curdle. And my licensed electrical contractor here, I gestured to Mike, advised me that according to the strict safety parameters of the Cape Coral Municipal Building Codes, adding even one more house to this temporary microgrid could potentially overload the alternator. I took a step closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear the final, devastating blow. Mike told me that if I plug in one more house, it constitutes a massive fire hazard under the very city code you tried to hit me with this afternoon, I said, my face a mask of faux tragedy. And as a responsible citizen, I simply cannot risk the safety of the neighborhood by violating the code you fought so hard to enforce today. My hands are legally tied. Brenda. She stared at me. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her brain was short-circuiting as she realized I was using her own malicious complaint as the exact weapon to deny her salvation. It was a perfect, inescapable trap, constructed entirely out of her own spite. "But," she whispered. "But, I'm sorry, Brenda," I said, turning back toward the grill. "I really am. But safety first, right? Stay cool, though." She stood there for another 10 seconds, frozen in the yellow glow of the patio lights, before slowly turning around and shuffling back into the suffocating darkness of her home. The block party resumed. The burgers were excellent. The beer was freezing cold. The generator ran perfectly all through the night, never missing a single beat. It took 3 full days for the power company to finally clear the lines and get the grid back up and running. For 3 days, I ran the neighborhood. For 3 days, Brenda sat in the dark. The icing on the cake? About 2 weeks after the power came back, the Neighborhood Beautification Committee finally resumed its normal operations. I walked out to check my mail and found a familiar pink slip sticking out of the box. It was a citation, addressed to Brenda. Apparently, during the chaos of the storm, she had left her plastic garbage cans out by the curb for 3 days straight, a direct violation of Section 4, Paragraph C of the Community Guidelines. She was fined $50. I looked over at her house. The beige paint looked a little more faded. The grass was a little overgrown, and the sensible haircut was nowhere to be seen. But I smiled, fired up my lawnmower, and went to work. It was a beautiful day in Florida.